lives, and that was actually pretty unusual. Because although in 1868, there was a Burlington Treaty, and it was a time when we needed labor, and Chinese men were brought over. They were excluded from citizenship, and they were expected to go back. And when they weren't going back, and they were out building canals in the valley and things like that, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. And this basically was the only immigration law that was ever passed in the United States that was on the basis of race. It basically said no Chinese. They were very afraid of this wave of people that would overtake California and the country. And that was extended in 1892 by the Geary Act. And in 1924, that was actually extended. And it wasn't until 1943, it was like 60 years of exclusion, that the Magnuson Act was passed when we were friendly with the Chinese for a while, allowing the Chinese in. And it wasn't until 1965 when we got rid of quotas by country, and that's when a lot of Chinese immigration came in. Now, we're mostly talking about people today that were born earlier. And as you can see, a lot of men came over to work, they were sending money back to their families. They either expected to go back or to eventually earn enough money to bring their families here. But in 1882, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, they couldn't bring their families with them. And so you'll find a big population of older Chinese men who had no families, had no way of having families, had no way to ever have a life, and were excluded, of course, from marrying into any other race, especially Caucasian. But these gentlemen were all, especially the ones I'm talking about now, Sung and Chang Kia-ngau, they came over as having helped the fight against the communists, and so they kind of got their special pass. For example, T.V. Sung, the older brother of T.A. Sung, financed Colonel Chennault's Flying Tigers in China during the war, so there were very strong connections there. Chang Kia-ngau was a financier, and he founded the Bank of China in Shanghai, and rose to prominence when a corrupt Kuomintang official tried to get him to take money out of the bank illegally, and he said no. That was in 1916. And he helped separate the bank from the government at that time to become an independent bank. But the Kuomintang always tried to get it back to be a government-controlled bank, and he fought those efforts, and that effort was led by T.V. Sung, T.A.'s brother, who wanted to get it in his hands, basically to plunder it. Whereas Chang Jiang really wanted to use the money to finance infrastructure in the country because he thought to become a modern country, it needed that, even if it wasn't the best return for the bank. But then H.H. Kung, you remember, one of T.A. Sung's sisters had married this financier. Kung staged a coup in 1935 and seized control of the bank. They couldn't quite get rid of a man as educated as this, so they made him head of the railways because he was so interested in infrastructure, and then the head of communications. But then, after the communist takeover, he was writing a lot about infrastructure and finance and Chinese economics, but he came to the U.S. and he worked at the Hoover Institute and died in Palo Alto and was buried here. So that gives you some sense of the kind of people who came here that we can find out information about, and sort of the context in which they came to the U.S. and the kind of people they were. And I want to point out, in terms of life and death, that there's T.A. Sung, one of the richest men in the world at the time he dies, and Liu Hing, who started out fairly penniless, and they're buried 20 feet from each other. And here is probably the biggest enemy of the Sung family. And what is he, 100 yards, crow flies away, buried in the same place in Mountain View in Oakland.